Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Shekalim Daf discusses lost and found objects of various types that have questionable halachic status because of their potential kedusha or potential kashrus. The Daf begins by discussing a number of incidents concerning the halacha of meat that was lost and then found, and the question of is it basar shenes aleim min ha'ayin. Then we'll begin a Mishnah, which will introduce the topic of animals that are found, which may or may not have been designated for kabbanos, and how you deal with them if they are safek a carbon. The Mishnah will also quote a couple of takanas which were made as to where you get menachos from when you have an animal that's being brought without a known owner, and 7 takanas on the subject, and the Gemara will analyze them. So first of all, we're discussing the halacha of basar shenes aleim min ha'ayin, and that is meat which has not been watched. You don't know where it's been. You know where it's been possibly, but you don't know what has happened to it. It's been unsupervised for a period of time, and it could have been switched, and that is also. So the Gemara brings a couple of stories about the halacha of basar shenes aleim min ha'ayin. The Gemara says that Rav went to Bavel from Eretz Yisrael, and he saw that they were not properly machmir or stringent on this halacha of basar shenes aleim min ha'ayin, and he told them that they should be. So the story that first happened was that they saw that there was somebody who was walking to a river in order to rinse off his meat. He went to the river, he came back, but he left his meat there, and he went back to the river, and he saw it was still there, so he picked it up and he went home. Rav said, you can't eat that, because I didn't know it's the same piece of meat. Maybe the river overflowed the banks, it took away your piece of meat, and then washed up a different piece in its place, and your meat was kosher, but this might be a different piece which is not kosher. Okay, another incident which happened was that there was somebody who was walking along the street, and he was carrying meat, and a vulture swooped down and grabbed the meat out of his hand and dropped it somewhere else. So he went to somewhere else, and he wanted to take it and continue with it. And Rav said to him, you can't. Maybe the vulture had a different piece of meat, and that's what he dropped, but your piece of meat he still has. And therefore this is not the same piece of meat that you lost, and this piece is not kosher. Next incident that happened was that the river Ginai came and it flooded some flasks of wine. It swept away flasks of wine. The incident came before Rabbi Yitzchak bar Elazar. And what had happened was that it had put the flasks back. It found the flasks were then returned from the river. So Yitzchak bar Elazar said, you can't assume it's the same flask necessarily, but there is a solution. You could have the people who tied the strings to seal it shut, or any other type of seal on it, if they can eyeball their work and recognize that it's the same one, then you could assume that it is the same one. Very similar story that happened was that there were barrels of wine that were found outside a shul in a city called Buli, and the question was, are these barrels of wine that were left there before? And the story came to Rabbi Yirmiyah, and he said the people who paint red marks on the side of the barrel should look at the work and see if they recognize their own work. If it is recognizable to them, then they can assume that it is the same. Another incident that happened was that there was a roasted goat that was found on the side of a main highway. So Gemara says the Chachamim passing that it's mutter on two accounts. There are two potential problems. Number one, are you allowed to take it? It's a found object. Do you have to return it, or are you allowed to just take it? On that, the Chachamim said yes, and they based it on the fact that there is a brisa that says if you find something in a situation where it's definitely lost from the owner can't possibly return it. Or you could assume that the owner was miyayish, that he gave up hope on never getting it back. Then he relinquished ownership, and whoever finds it is allowed to keep it. The examples that the Brisa brings was, if you saved something from the mouth of a lion, the owner definitely didn't intend to get that back. Or you saved it from a troop of marauders. Or if you saved it from a flooding tide or an overflowing river, or on the side of a major highway, or from a major central square of a town. All these places, it's definitely not going to be restored, and therefore the owner gives up hope, and you're allowed to keep it. So this goat was found on the side of the road, so there's no problem as far as the halacha of Hashavas Aveda. Now, what about the problem of kashrus? So since the majority of the people in the city in which it was found are kosher-keeping Jews, so you could assume that it was kosher meat, because you follow the majority, and you assume it's from the majority of the meat that's in the town. Now, the Gemara has a similar situation where a block of cheese, a circular piece of cheese, was found in a hotel run by Levi, but that hotel was also a very high traffic area, and therefore it has the same halacha as the major road. And the Gemara quotes the same brisa again to show that it was no problem of Hashavas Aveda. And as far as maybe it was cheese made by a guy and belonging to a guy, the Gemara said not a problem because Roiv, majority of the people that pass through that area are Jews. Now, the Gemara says that in the end of the first incident, it was found who the roasted goat belonged to. It actually belonged to the house of Rebbe. And in the second case of the cheese, it was found belonging to Rabbi Yossi, it was found belonging to Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Yossi, and therefore in both circumstances it was correct that it was slaughtered and it was prepared in a kosher fashion. So Gemara now says that Rav Mana asked Rabbi Yossi that how come, if you're allowed to take things which are found on the side of the road or in a public area like this, how come the Chachamim do return such things? They announce that they found it and they go ahead and they return it. So he said, wouldn't you return it? Your father used to say that I wish whenever I find something it should be from the inside of the intersection, meaning from the inner part of the city relative to the main highway. That is, you have a main highway that splits off into smaller roads. You want it to be on the main part of the road because there you're allowed to keep it. And you see, therefore, he's saying that the halacha is that if it's on the main highway, you are allowed to keep it. But still, he returned it. He had things like that. So it's Lefanim Yishor Din. He goes beyond the letter of the law and returns it even though he's not obligated to. Okay, this concludes that Gemara. Now we get to the Mishnah, which discusses what happens when you find animals, live, living animals, and you don't know if they're karbanos or not. So Gemara says, within a certain radius of Yerushalayim, within a circle with Yerushalayim at the center, you have to assume that they are karbanos. What's that radius? The Gemara says the radius from Yerushalayim at the center is as large as the distance from Yerushalayim to Migdal Eder. So anything which is the same distance from Yerushalayim as Migdal Eder, or closer, has the halacha of being in this Yerushalayim zone. Now, Migdal Eder is a town near Beis Lechem, so it's about the distance of Beis Lechem from Yerushalayim. Now, what is the halacha? The halacha is you have to assume that it is karbanos. Most animals in the Yerushalayim area are karbanos. And then the question then is, which type of carbon is it? How do you know? So Gemara says, well, if it's a male, you should assume it is a carbon ola. If it's a female, you should assume that it's a carbon shlomim. Now, shlomim could be a male or a female, but an ola can only be a male. Now, this is the opinion of the Tanakama. The Gemara will explain exactly how you know that it's an ola. If it's a male, because maybe it's a shlomim. Shlomim could also be a male. The Gemara says, however, there is a disputing opinion here, which is a Behuda, and he says this is all true, except if it is 30 days before Pesach, or within 30 days of Pesach, and it's an animal which could be a carbon Pesach, meaning it's within its first year of life, and it's a male sheep or goat. He says you have to assume, or you have to assume that it is a carbon Pesach. Now the Tanakama disagrees. He says nobody loses their carbon Pesach; they're extra careful with it. Now the problem is whoever finds this animal and is volunteering to bring it as a carbon, and he's figuring out which one he's supposed to bring, also has to bring nesachim. There has to be flour and wine. There has to be wine and oil that goes along with these karbanos. So who's paying for that? So the Mishnah says in the beginning they used to force the person who was bringing it, the one who found it, to pay for it. But then what was happening was that people were just leaving the animals, running away from it, and saying, "Why do I need to bring this animal? Well, if I find the animal, I have to bring it, and then they can make me pay for the nesachim." Not interested. So in order to change their practice, they made a takana that the public funds should pay for those nesachim, and the person who finds it doesn't need to pay for it. Now this is one of 7 takanas which are made on similar subjects of who brings nesachim and some other subjects of karbanos, and the Mishnah now lists all of them. The next takana is when a goy sent a carbon from outside of Eretz Yisrael, and if he sent money for the nesachim, okay, then you use the money for nesachim. If you didn't send, you couldn't get hold of the guy, so they would take the money for those nesachim from the money set aside for karbanos tzibor. Same thing applies if a ger died without any descendants, without any children. A ger is the only person who could have no inheritors. If he doesn't have any family, he's considered to be newborn when he converts, and therefore he has no relatives, and only if he gets relatives afterwards does he have inheritors, but he could possibly have no inheritors. So then his property will become hefker. But if we find that he was a makdish, some of his property, to be karbanos, so you bring those as karbanos, but the question is, what are you going to do with nesachim? Now the first person who got to his property, it now belongs to him, so you can't force him to pay for the nesachim. The property is his, it doesn't belong to the ger anymore. So they took it from karbanos tzibor funds. Next halacha is that when a kohen gadol passes away, and there is nobody to bring the special minchas chavitin. The Kohen Hagadol had to bring a carbon every day, a carbon mincha of a tenth of an ephah of flour. It was split half in the morning and half in the afternoon. But if he died, he couldn't bring it. So where do you bring it from? So the Mishnah brings a machlokes. According to the Tanakama, you bring it from public funds. According to Rabbi Yehuda, you bring it from the property of the inheritors, those who inherit from the Kohen Gadol. The Mishnah notes it was brought at once. It wasn't split into two halves, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. It was brought in one shot. The Gemara will explain how exactly that one shot worked. Okay, next takana, this is the fifth one, is not really related to this topic. It just says that the Kohanim were allowed to use the salt and the wood in the Beis HaMikdash. Now, the salt and wood were hektish. It had to be salt on every carbon. It had to be wood to fuel the fire. But you weren't allowed to use it for your own private things. But the Kohanim were allowed to use it to cook or properly prepare the meat, or to roast the meat, or even to have the fire running in the Beis HaMikdash where they stayed. And the reason that they were allowed to use it was it's considered to be a hektish use, so that they would be able to properly eat the carbon meats. Next, takana, the sixth one was that the parah aduma does not incur me'il. If somebody uses the parah aduma for his own or purposes, he doesn't have to bring a carbon for using hektish. And the last takana is that if a woman or somebody who's chayav to bring carbonos of birds lost the birds became a puzzle for whatever reason, they have to be replaced. And she doesn't know about it. We don't even know who she is because she gave the money to buy the birds and now it's lost, and what are we supposed to do with it? It's ruined. So, again, it's a machlokes who has to replace it. According to the Tanakama, it's replaced from public carbon funds. According to Rabbi Yossi, it's replaced by the person who supplies birds to the Beis HaMikdash. If there's a psol, he's the one who has to pay for it. Okay, that concludes the Mishnah. Now the Gemara begins by discussing what happens when we said you find an animal. So if it's a male and if it's within the zone of karbanos, you're assuming that it's a carbon, you should bring it as an ola. So the Gemara says, what gives you the right to bring it as an ola? If it's supposed to be a shlamim, and it's different halachas, you can't just bring it as an ola. You would be putting meat on the mizbeach that doesn't belong there. It's a shlamim meat, it's not supposed to go on the mizbeach if it's a shlamim. So how could you just bring it as an ola? Now the Gemara offers three approaches to resolve this. The first is Rabbi who says that actually what happens is you have to bring a carbon ola and a carbon shlamim, and you don't bring the animal itself as either of them. You have to change the kedusha onto money. So you redeem the animal, you sell it, this kedusha is transferred to money. Then you actually have to transfer this kedusha onto two piles of money. You set aside two piles. You say one is if this animal is a shlamim, the kedusha goes onto this pile, and now it's shlamim money. And if the animal was an ola, then it goes onto this other pile, and that's ola money. Then you take the two of them, you buy a carbon ola with the ola money, a shlamim with the shlamim money, to bring each one properly. That way, we know exactly what you're bringing. You're not bringing anything that's wrong. In one situation, you were makdish it from nothing. In one situation, it was the transferred kedusha from the animal that was found. We don't know which one's which, but that's fine as long as you makdish them both. So now the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan has a kash on this, and he says, how could you tell people to go redeem a kachim animal? And once an animal is hooked to the mizbech, and not allowed to redeem it unless it has a mum. So you can't do this procedure. So he gives a different answer. And he says that there's no problem. You follow majority. The halacha is majority rules. And the majority of male animals are olos. And therefore you bring it as an ola. You don't have to be concerned that it's from the minority. So Gemara rejects this. The Gemara says it's not true. Who told you that the majority of animals that are male are olos? Shlamim could also be an ola. Maybe you have just as many shlamim as olos. Maybe more, as far as the male animals are concerned. So therefore, the Gemara says, no, what Rabbi Yochanan meant to say was that you take the animal and you let it get a mum. And once it gets a mum, then you can redeem it, and you redeem it onto two piles of money, as we said before. The Gemara offers the third approach. This is Rabbi Zira, who says that Beis Din made it tonight. That anybody who makes an animal into a carbon, Beis Din has the right to take their hektish and turn it into carbon ola. They could uproot his money, his ownership of his money before he was makdish it, and they turn it into an ola. And they do that al tanai, that will take effect if something happens to the animal that he was originally makdish, if it gets lost or something like that. So the Gemara asks that I understand that we said that you could do this in a case of where money was lost, where money was found, where we said that you turn the money into money for an ola. But who said you could do that on a carbon itself? You're gonna maybe this carbon's a shlamim. You're saying you could uproot the shlamim kedusha and put on ola kedusha? Gemara says no, you're not uprooting. The original kedusha was only hinging on the assumption, on the eventuality that this animal ended up being brought as the carbon ola. If something happens to it, it was set up originally that kedusha should not exist in the first place, and it should become an ola in the first place. The Mishnah had mentioned the minchas chavitin of the Kohen Gadol. The Gemara now brings a couple of halachos on that subject. First of all, the Gemara brings a memra that we've seen a couple of times in the Masechta. Rabbi Yasser says, when I was in Bavel, I heard the voice of Rabbi Yehuda asking Shmuel, if somebody sets aside his shekel, what happens to the shekel if he dies before it's actually given? And Rabbi Yehuda said it goes to the Nedava boxes, one of the boxes for general voluntary karbanos tibor. You can't have a shekel in the regular shkalim box that is ownerless. Now, Yasser says another halacha that he heard then, that he says that what happens if a Kohen, a gadol, sets aside money for his minchas chavitin, that's the mincha he has to bring every day. And here, Rabbi Yochanan says that the money, if there was extra money, he didn't spend it all on his minchas chavitin, that extra money has to go to the Yamamach, and that's because you're not allowed to use it for anything else. You can't put it in the regular box of machatzis shekel karbanos fund, because only leftovers from real karbanos, animal karbanos, could go in there, but not leftovers from a karban mincha. You can't use it because they're hektish. You can't redeem it because it has kedushas aguf, so it has to go to the Yamamach, has to be destroyed. Rabbi Elazar says no, it could go into the hektish box, it could go into the nedava box. You could use it to buy other karbanos. That's fine. So now the Gemara quotes a machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish as to how you split the asiras eifa. The karban minchas chavitin was 1/10 of an eifa, and asiras eifa, and had to be split half in the morning with the karban tabit and half in the afternoon. So how do you split it? So according to Rabbi Yochanan, you split it before you put it in any klishares. Before it has kedusha, you split it into two halves of 1/10 of an eifa, and then you makadesh each one in the klishares one at a time. Right? When you put a carbon or a mincha into klishares, that's when it gets its kedushas karbanis. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Reish Lakish says, no, you first put it in the kli, and then afterwards you split it. That way you're bringing it together, it's miskadesh together as one. So Gemara now wants to bring up Mishnah and Menachos, and the Gemara will show first half of the Mishnah goes like Rabbi Yochanan, and the second half of the Mishnah, the first half of the Mishnah is a kasha on Rabbi Yochanan, and the second half of the Mishnah is a kasha on Reish Lakish. What does the Mishnah say? Mishnah says, what happens when a Kohen Gadol brings his carbon, his minchas chavitin, he brings the first half in the morning, then he dies, and you replace him with another carbon, and now he's ready to bring the minchas chavitin in the afternoon. So he can't bring the other half of the carbon that was brought by the first Kohen Gadol. He can't use that half. That half has to go be destroyed. He has to bring another whole asiras eifa, bring half of it, and the second half of that one has nothing to be done with it, so that gets destroyed. The Mishnah concludes and says, so you see that there is half of both karbanos are brought, and half of both karbanos, both asiras eifa, is destroyed. So Gemara says, first of all, why does it have to be destroyed? Why can't you just take it home? According to Rabbi Yochanan, it didn't have kedusha yet. It wasn't put in the klishares until it was divided. So only the half that's meant to be put on the mizbech is actually put into a klishares, and that gets kedusha. The other half never got kedusha, so let him take it home and use it. So this is what I mean. This is Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan, we know, he says even the money you set aside to buy, you can't use anything else for it. It already has kedusha. Certainly the flour itself, even though you didn't put it in klishares yet, has kedusha, so that's not a kasha. Gemara says, but however, later the Mishnah, it says that the heft that you're going to destroy, you can't destroy right away. You have to leave it overnight, let it get a psul, an innate psul, in itself of being left overnight, of lina. And it should become nicer, and only then can you destroy it. The halach, of course, like we've seen many times, is you can't destroy something that just can't be brought. It has to have an innate psul. So, according to Reish Lakish, that it had kedusha, it was put in the klishares, and you're not going to use it. So that's an innate psul. You should be able to just burn it on the spot. Why do you have to wait until the night goes over it and it gets the psul of nicer? So the Gemara will tell you that is the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel holds that putting flour in a klishares is not mekadesh it at all. So you're right. I said my opinion. I said my shita that you put it in the klishares before you divide it. That's true. And according to Rabbi Akiva, who we paskin like, that means that it has kedusha before you divide it. However, this memory here was said by Rabbi Shmuel, who says that in the klishares it doesn't even get kedusha, and therefore there is no problem. Then there's no innate psul. He can't bring it, and therefore you have to wait until it gets a real psul. Okay, now the Gemara discusses the Minchas Chavitin and the Minchas Chinuch. Both of these were a tenth of an ephah. The Minchas Chavitin is that of the Kohen Gadol that's brought every day. The Minchas Chinuch is brought by each Kohen at the beginning of his service. And the Gemara says it could be brought by the Kohen himself or anybody else. And the Minchas Chinuch is brought by the Kohen Hagadol when he starts his job, and by the Kohen Hedyot, the regular Kohen, when they start their job. Now, what happens if the Kohen begins the avoda before he brings his Minchas Chinuch? He's supposed to bring the Minchas Chinuch first. It should be his first carbon. But what happens if he does avoda before that? So the avoda is kosher. Says the Gemara, another halacha, Rabbi Mona, says what happens if a Kohen is appointed as a Kohen and as a Kohen Gadol on the same day. So he has to bring a Minchas Chinuch and a Minchas Chavitin of the Kohen Hagadol. Now, this means he's bringing 2 karbanos when he's really supposed to be bringing 3, because one of the karbanos counts for 2 and 1. That is, he became a Kohen Hedyot, or he began his avoda as a Kohen Hedyot, he became a Kohen Gadol, and there's also a Minchas Chavitin that has to be brought every day. So he's bringing 3 karbanos, but he's only bringing 2, because the one for the Chinuch as a Kohen Hedyot and the Chinuch as the Kohen Gadol, that's wrapped into 1. Now this is what Rabbi Mona wants to say over here. The Gemara in Menachos rejects this and says that he actually has to bring 3 karbanos. Okay, next halacha. The pasuk describing the Minchas Chavitin says that it's al machlas b'shem te'aser morbeches teviena tufine. That means that it has to have 3 stages in its preparation. It has to be fried, cooked, and baked. The Gemara says that the baking part of it, tufine, is written right next to tiviena. It has to be brought. Tufini has to be brought in its baked state. That means that just like the bringing has to be during the daytime, you can't bring it at night. You also can't bake it at night. It has to be baked after sunrise. The Gemara asks, but that doesn't seem to be correct, because the Mishnah in the Talmud describes the avoda, and it says that the Gizbarim would wake up the people who make the chavitin before dawn, and they would say, start making the chavitin. So you see that they are able to bake it. So the Gemara says, no, they didn't bake it then. They just boiled the water. You needed to have hot water to knead the flour, the special fine flour, into, and therefore that's what they did. But they didn't actually do the baking until after sunrise. The Gemara now discusses what is the order of the preparations. We have a frying and a baking. Which one comes first? So the Gemara says the machlok is whether you fry it first or you bake it first. The Gemara says that it's based on a 3-way machlok is what the word tufini means. The Gemara says tufini is a contraction of teafena na. It should be baked in na. What does the word na mean? So according to one opinion, na means that it should be somewhat cooked. It should be not fully cooked and somewhat cooked. That means it's already fried. So you fry it first and then you bake it. According to the other pshat, na means beautiful, like from the word na'ah, and therefore you want it to be beautiful, not fried yet. Once it's fried, it turns black. Or there's the third opinion that says it means both things, and therefore you have to bake it first, the first time when it's raw, then you have to fry it, and then you have to bake it when it's already fried in order to be mekayim both halachos. Now, we had seen earlier that the halacha is that if a Kohen Gadol dies, the second Kohen that replaces him has to bring a Minchas Chavitin. He can't use the other half of the original Kohen's Mincha. He has to bring his own new Minchas Chavitin. So Gemara says it's not only if he dies, even if something happens to him. The Gemara says, okay, well, what happens to him? So the Gemara has a possibility that it's only if he gets a mum. So if he gets a mum, he'll never be a Kohen Gadol again. He can never come back into service. And therefore, it's just the same as if he dies, and whoever's coming to replace him has to bring a complete new carbon. The Gemara's question is, what if he just becomes Tameh? If he becomes Tameh, he has to be temporarily replaced. The question is, does the Kohen who's replacing have to bring a new carbon, Minchas Chavitin, or could he just bring the other half of the old one? So Gemara quotes a brisa, which seems to indicate it's only if he gets a mum. If he becomes Tameh, then you don't have to bring a new one. Okay, now, the Gemara goes back to Machlokes we had mentioned in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says there's Machlokes if the Kohen dies and you did not appoint somebody to replace him. Where do you get a Minchas Chavitin from? So the Mishnah had brought a Machlokes between Tanakama and Rabbi Shimon. The Gemara now says that the Tanakama is Rabbi Yehuda. It's Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. Where this carbon comes from? According to Rabbi Shimon, it comes from the Tzibur, the public. That was actually the Tana Kama, and Rabbi Yehuda says that it comes from his inheritors, his Yorshim. So Gemara says that they both get it from Psukim. Pasuk says, "V'kohen HaMashiach tachtav," the Kohen HaMashiach, meaning the Kohen HaGadol, tachtav. Instead of him, Yibanav Yasa Isai, from his children you should bring it. Not a simple pshat in the pasuk, but that's what Yehuda is reading to say that the inheritors have to bring it. Now, how do you know you don't split it in half? Because the pasuk says, Isa, you bring it, meaning all at once. It's in one shot. Now, Rabbi Shimon says it comes from a different pasuk. It says Chak Olam. Chak Olam means there should be a rule for the Olam, the whole congregation. They have to bring it. Now, once it's being brought from the congregation, you may think that they get a chance to eat it. All the karbanos of Kohanim, the karbanos of Mincha of Kohanim, are totally burned. But this one is brought by the congregation, so maybe you could eat it. So on that, it continues, the pasuk continues and says, Kalil Taktar, it all has to be burned, even in this situation, where it's being brought by the Olam, the Chag Olam, it all has to be burned.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.